Monday, August 7th, 1961. I arrived at Don Juan's house in Arizona about 7 o'clock on Friday night. 5 other Indians were sitting with him on the porch of his house. I greeted him and sat waiting for them to say something. After a formal silence, one of the men got up, walked over to me, and said, "Buenas noches." I stood up and answered, "Buenas noches." Then all the other men got up and came to me, and we all mumbled "Buenas noches" and shook hands, either by barely touching one another's fingertips or by holding the hand for an instant and then dropping it quite abruptly. We all sat down again. They seemed to be rather shy, at a loss for words, although they all spoke Spanish. It must have been about 7:30 when suddenly they all got up and walked toward the back of the house. Nobody had said a word for a long time. Don Juan signaled me to follow, and we all got inside an old pickup truck parked there. I sat in the back with Don Juan and 2 younger men. There were no cushions or benches, and the metal floor was painfully hard, especially when we left the highway and got onto a dirt road. Don Juan whispered that we were going to the house of one of his friends who had 7 mezcalitos for me. I asked him, "Don't you have any of them yourself, Don Juan?" "I do, but I couldn't offer them to you. You see, someone else has to do this." "Can you tell me why?" "Perhaps you're not agreeable to him, and he won't like you, and then you'll never be able to know him with affection, as one should, and our friendship will be broken." "Why wouldn't he like me? I've never done anything to him." "You don't have to do anything to be liked or disliked. He either takes you or throws you away." "But if he doesn't take me, isn't there anything I can do to make him like me?" The other 2 men heard my question and laughed. "No, I can't think of anything one can do," Don Juan said. He turned half away from me, and I couldn't talk to him anymore. We must have driven for at least an hour before we stopped in front of a small house. It was quite dark, and after the driver had turned off the headlights, I could make out only the vague contour of the building. A young woman, a Mexican, judging by her speech inflection, was yelling at a dog to make him stop barking. We got out of the truck and walked into the house. The men mumbled "Buenas noches" as they went by her. She answered back and went on yelling at the dog. The room was large and was stacked up with a multitude of objects. A dim light from a very small electric bulb rendered the scene quite gloomy. There were quite a few chairs with broken legs and sagging seats leaning against the walls. 3 of the men sat down on a couch, which was the largest single piece of furniture in the room. It was very old and had sagged down all the way to the floor. In the dim light, it seemed to be red and dirty. The rest of us sat in chairs. We sat in silence for a long time. One of the men suddenly got up and went into another room. He was perhaps in his 50s, dark, tall, and husky. He came back a moment later with a coffee jar. He opened the lid and handed the jar to me. Inside, there were 7 odd-looking items. They varied in size and consistency. Some of them were almost round, others were elongated. They felt to the touch like the pulp of walnuts or the surface of cork. Their brownish color made them look like hard, dry nutshells. I handled them, rubbing their surfaces for quite some time. "This is to be chewed. Esto se masca," Don Juan said in a whisper. I hadn't realized that he had sat next to me until he spoke. I looked at the other men, but no one was looking at me. They were talking among themselves in very low voices. This was a moment of acute indecision and fear. I felt almost unable to control myself. "I have to go to the bathroom," I said to him. "I'll go outside and take a walk." He handed me the coffee jar, and I put the peyote buttons in it. I was leaving the room when the man who had given me the jar stood up, came to me, and said he had a toilet bowl in the other room. The toilet was almost against the door. Next to it, nearly touching the toilet, was a large bed which occupied more than half of the room. The woman was sleeping there. I stood motionless at the door for a while. Then I came back to the room where the other men were. The man who owned the house spoke to me in English. Don Juan says you're from South America. Is there any mezcal there? I told him that I had never even heard of it. They seemed to be interested in South America, and we talked about the Indians for a while. Then one of the men asked me why I wanted to eat peyote. I told him that I wanted to know what it was like. They all laughed shyly. Don Juan urged me softly. Chew it, chew it. Masca, masca. My hands were wet and my stomach contracted. The jar with the peyote buttons was on the floor by the chair. I bent over, took one at random, and put it in my mouth. It had a stale taste. I bit it in two and started to chew one of the pieces. I felt a strong, pungent bitterness. In a moment, my whole mouth was numb. The bitterness increased as I kept on chewing, forcing an incredible flow of saliva. My gums and the inside of my mouth felt as if I had eaten salty, dry meat or fish, which seems to force one to chew more. After a while, I chewed the other piece, and my mouth was so numb I couldn't feel the bitterness anymore. The peyote button was a bunch of shreds, like the fibrous part of an orange or like sugar cane, and I didn't know whether to swallow it or spit it out. At that moment, the owner of the house got up and invited everybody to go out to the porch. We went out and sat in the darkness. It was quite comfortable outside, and the host brought out a bottle of tequila. The men were seated in a row with their backs to the wall. I was at the extreme right of the line. Don Juan, who was next to me, placed the jar with the peyote buttons between my legs. Then he handed me the bottle, which was passed down the line, and told me to take some of the tequila to wash away the bitterness. I spit out the shreds of the first button and took a sip. He told me not to swallow it, but to just rinse out my mouth with it to stop the saliva. It didn't help much with the saliva, but it certainly helped to wash away some of the bitterness. Don Juan gave me a piece of dried apricot, or perhaps it was a dried fig. I couldn't see it in the dark, nor could I taste it, and told me to chew it thoroughly and slowly, without rushing. I had difficulty swallowing it. It felt as if it wouldn't go down. After a short pause, the bottle went around again. Don Juan handed me a piece of crispy dried meat. I told him I didn't feel like eating. "This is not eating," he said firmly. The pattern was repeated 6 times. I remember having chewed 6 peyote buttons when the conversation became very lively. Although I couldn't distinguish what language was spoken, the topic of the conversation, in which everybody participated, was very interesting, and I attempted to listen carefully so that I could take part. But when I tried to speak, I realized I couldn't. The words shifted aimlessly about in my mind. I sat with my back propped against the wall and listened to what the men were saying. They were talking in Italian and repeated over and over one phrase about the stupidity of sharks. I thought it was a logical, coherent topic. I had told Don Juan earlier that the Colorado River in Arizona was called by the early Spaniards El Río de los Tizones, the river of charred wood, and someone misspelled or misread Tizones, and the river was called El Río de los Tiburones, the river of the sharks. I was sure they were discussing that story, yet it never occurred to me to think that none of them could speak Italian. I had a very strong desire to throw up. The actual act. I asked if somebody would get me some water. I was experiencing an unbearable thirst. Don Juan brought me a large saucepan. He placed it on the ground next to the wall. He also brought a little cup or can. He dipped it into the pan and handed it to me and said I couldn't drink but should just freshen my mouth with it. The water looked strangely shiny, glossy, like a thick varnish. I wanted to ask Don Juan about it, and laboriously I tried to voice my thoughts in English, but then I realized he didn't speak English. I experienced a very confusing moment, and became aware of the fact that although there was a clear thought in my mind, I couldn't speak. I wanted to comment on the strange quality of the water, but what followed next was not speech. It was the feeling of my unvoiced thoughts coming out of my mouth in a sort of liquid form. It was an effortless sensation of vomiting without the contractions of the diaphragm. It was a pleasant flow of liquid words. I drank, and the feeling that I was vomiting disappeared. By that time, all noises had vanished, and I found I had difficulty focusing my eyes. I looked for Don Juan, and as I turned my head, I noticed that my field of vision had diminished to a circular area in front of my eyes. This feeling was neither frightening nor discomforting, but quite to the contrary. It was a novelty. I could literally sweep the ground by focusing on one spot and then moving my head slowly in any direction. When I had first come out to the porch, I'd noticed it was all dark except for the distant glare of the city lights. Yet, within the circular area of my vision, everything was clear. I forgot about my concern with Don Juan and the other men, and gave myself entirely to exploring the ground with my pinpoint vision. I saw the juncture of the porch floor and the wall. I turned my head slowly to the right, following the wall, and saw Don Juan sitting against it. I shifted my head to the left in order to focus on the water. I found the bottom of the pan. I raised my head slightly and saw a medium-sized black dog approaching. I saw him coming toward the water. The dog began to drink. I raised my hand to push him away from the water. I focused my pinpoint vision on the dog to carry on the movement, and suddenly I saw him become transparent. The water was a shiny, viscous liquid. I saw it going down the dog's throat into his body. I saw it flowing evenly through his entire length and then shooting out through each one of the hairs. I saw the iridescent fluid traveling along the length of each individual hair and then projecting out of the hairs to form a long, white, silky mane. At that moment, I had the sensation of intense convulsions, and in a matter of instants, a tunnel formed around me, very low and narrow, hard and strangely cold. It felt to the touch like a wall of solid tinfoil. I found I was sitting on the tunnel floor. I tried to stand up, but hit my head on the metal roof, and the tunnel compressed itself until it was suffocating me. I remember having to crawl toward a sort of round point where the tunnel ended. When I finally arrived, if I did, I had forgotten all about the dog, Don Juan, and myself. I was exhausted. My clothes were soaked in a cold, sticky liquid. I rolled back and forth, trying to find a position in which to rest, a position where my heart would not pound so hard. In one of those shifts, I saw the dog again. Every memory came back to me at once, and suddenly all was clear in my mind. I turned around to look for Don Juan, but I couldn't distinguish anything or anyone. All I was capable of seeing was the dog becoming iridescent. An intense light radiated from his body. I saw again the water flowing through him, kindling him like a bonfire. I got to the water, sank my face in the pan, and drank with him. My hands were in front of me on the ground, and as I drank, I saw the fluid running through my veins, setting up hues of red and yellow and green. I drank more and more. I drank until I was all afire. I was all aglow. I drank until the fluid went out of my body through each pore and projected out like fibers of silk, and I, too, acquired a long, lustrous, iridescent mane. I looked at the dog, and his mane was like mine. A supreme happiness filled my whole body, and we ran together toward a sort of yellow warmth that came from some indefinite place. And there we played. We played and wrestled until I knew his wishes and he knew mine. We took turns manipulating each other in the fashion of a puppet show. I could make him move his legs by twisting my toes, and every time he nodded his head, I felt an irresistible impulse to jump. But his most impish act was to make me scratch my head with my foot while I sat. He did it by flapping his ears from side to side. This action was to me utterly, unbearably funny. Such a touch of grace and irony, such mastery, I thought. The euphoria that possessed me was indescribable. I laughed until it was almost impossible to breathe. I had the clear sensation of not being able to open my eyes. I was looking through a tank of water. It was a long and very painful state, filled with the anxiety of not being able to wake up and yet being awake. Then slowly, the world became clear and in focus. My field of vision became again very round and ample, and with it came an ordinary conscious act, which was to turn around and look for that marvelous being. At this point, I encountered the most difficult transition. The passage from my normal state had taken place almost without my realizing it. I was aware. My thoughts and feelings were a corollary of that awareness, and the passing was smooth and clear. But this second change, the awakening to serious, sober consciousness, was genuinely shocking. I had forgotten I was a man. The sadness of such an irreconcilable situation was so intense that I wept. Saturday, August 5th, 1961. Later that morning, after breakfast, Don Juan and I drove back to Don Juan's place. I was very tired, but I couldn't go to sleep in the truck. Only after the man had left did I fall asleep on the porch of Don Juan's house. When I woke up, it was dark. Don Juan had covered me up with a blanket. I looked for him, but he wasn't in the house. He came later with a pot of fried beans and a stack of tortillas. I was extremely hungry. After we'd finished eating and were resting, he asked me to tell him all that had happened to me the night before. I related my experience in great detail and as accurately as possible. When I finished, he nodded his head and said, "I think you're fine. It's difficult for me to explain now how and why, but I think it went all right for you. You see, sometimes he is playful, like a child. At other times, he is terrible, fearsome. He either frolics or he is dead serious. It's impossible to know beforehand what he'll be like with another person. Yet, when one knows him well, sometimes. You played with him tonight. You're the only person I know who's had such an encounter." "In what way does my experience differ from that of others?" "You're not an Indian. Therefore, it is hard for me to figure out what is what. Yet he either takes people or rejects them, regardless of whether they are Indians or not. That I know. I've seen numbers of them. I also know that he frolics. He makes some people laugh. But never have I seen him play with anyone." "Can you tell me now, Don Juan, how does peyote protect..." he didn't let me finish. Vigorously, he touched me on the shoulder. Don't you ever name him that way. You haven't seen enough of him yet to know him. How does Mescalito protect people? He advises. He answers whatever questions you ask. Then Mescalito is real? I mean, he's something you can see? He seemed to be baffled by my question. He looked at me with a sort of blank expression. What I mean to say is that Mescalito... I heard what you said. Didn't you see him last night? I wanted to say that I saw only a dog, but I noticed his bewildered look. Then you think what I saw last night was him? He looked at me with contempt. He chuckled, shook his head as though he couldn't believe it, and in a very belligerent tone he added, ¿A poco crees que era tu mamá? Don't tell me you believe it was your mama. He paused before saying mamá because what he meant to say was tu chingada madre, an idiom used as a disrespectful allusion to the other party's mother. The word mamá was so incongruous that we both laughed for a long time. Then I realized he had fallen asleep and hadn't answered my question. Sunday, August 6th, 1961. I drove Don Juan to the house where I'd taken peyote. On the way, he told me that the name of the man who had offered me to Mescalito was John. When we got to the house, we found John sitting on his porch with two young men. All of them were extremely jovial. They laughed and talked with great ease. The three of them spoke English perfectly. I told John that I'd come to thank him for having helped me. I wanted to get their views on my behavior during the hallucinogenic experience, and told them I'd been trying to think of what I had done that night and that I couldn't remember. They laughed and were reluctant to talk about it. They seemed to be holding back on account of Don Juan. They all glanced at him, as though waiting for an affirmative cue to go on. Don Juan must have cued them, although I didn't notice anything because suddenly John began to tell me what I'd done that night. He said he knew I'd been taken when he heard me puking. He estimated that I must have puked 30 times. Don Juan corrected him and said it was only 10 times. John continued. Then we all moved next to you. You were stiff and were having convulsions. For a very long time while lying on your back, you moved your mouth as though talking. Then you began to bump your head on the floor, and Don Juan put an old hat on your head, and you stopped it. You shivered and whined for hours, lying on the floor. I think everybody fell asleep then, but I heard you puffing and groaning in my sleep. Then I heard you scream, and I woke up. I saw you leaping up in the air, screaming. You made a dash for the water, knocked the pan over, and began to swim in the puddle. Don Juan brought you more water. You sat quietly in front of the pan. Then you jumped up and took off all your clothes. You were kneeling in front of the water, drinking in big gulps. Then you just sat there and stared into space. We thought you were going to be there forever. Nearly everybody was asleep, including Don Juan, when suddenly you jumped up again, howling, and took after the dog. The dog got scared and howled too, and ran to the back of the house. Then everybody woke up. We all got up. You came back from the other side, still chasing the dog. The dog was running ahead of you, barking and howling. I think you must have gone 20 times around the house, running in circles, barking like a dog. I was afraid people were going to be curious. There are no neighbors close, but your howling was so loud it could have been heard for miles. One of the young men added, "You caught up with the dog and brought it to the porch in your arms." John continued. Then you began to play with the dog. You wrestled with him, and the dog and you bit each other and played. That, I thought, was funny. My dog doesn't play usually, but this time you and the dog were rolling on each other. Then you ran to the water and the dog drank with you, the young man said. You ran 5 or 6 times to the water with the dog. How long did this go on? I asked. Hours, John said. At one time we lost sight of you two. I think you must have run to the back. We just heard you barking and groaning. You sounded so much like a dog that we couldn't tell you two apart. Maybe it was just the dog alone, I said. They laughed, and John said, You were barking there, boy. What happened next? The 3 men looked at one another and seemed to have a hard time deciding what happened next. Finally, the young man, who had not yet said anything, spoke up. He choked, he said, looking at John. Yes, you certainly choked. You began to cry very strangely, and then you fell to the floor. We thought you were biting your tongue. Don Juan opened your jaws and poured water on your face. Then you started shivering and having convulsions all over again. Then you stayed motionless for a long time. Don Juan said it was all over. By then it was morning, so we covered you with a blanket and left you to sleep on the porch. He stopped there and looked at the other men, who were obviously trying not to laugh. He turned to Don Juan and asked him something. Don Juan smiled and answered the question. John turned to me and said, We left you here on the porch because we were afraid you were going to piss all over the rooms. They all laughed very loudly. What was the matter with me? I asked. Did you? John sort of mimicked me. We weren't going to mention it, but Don Juan says it's all right. You pissed all over my dog. What did I do? You don't think the dog was running because he was afraid of you, do you? The dog was running because you were pissing on him. There was general laughter at this point. I tried to question one of the young men, but they were all laughing, and he didn't hear me. John went on. My dog got even, though. He pissed on you, too. This statement was apparently utterly funny, because they all roared with laughter, including Don Juan. When they'd quieted down, I asked in all earnestness, Is it really true? This really happened? Still laughing, John replied, I swear my dog really pissed on you. Driving back to Don Juan's place, I asked him, Did all that really happen, Don Juan? Yes, he said. But they don't know what you saw. They don't realize you were playing with him. That's why I didn't disturb you. But is this business of the dog and me pissing on each other true? It was not a dog. How many times do I have to tell you that? This is the only way to understand it. It's the only way. It was he who played with you. Did you know all this was happening before I told you about it? He vacillated for an instant before answering. No. I remembered, after you told me about it, the strange way you looked. I just suspected you were doing fine because you didn't seem scared. Did the dog really play with me, as they say? God damn it, it was not a dog. Thursday, August 17th, 1961. I told Don Juan how I felt about my experience. From the point of view of my intended work, it had been a disastrous event. I said I didn't care for another similar encounter with Mescalito. I agreed that everything that had happened to me had been more than interesting, but added that nothing in it could really move me towards seeking it again. I seriously believed that I wasn't constructed for that type of endeavor. Peyote had produced in me, as a post-reaction, a strange kind of physical discomfort. It was an indefinite fear or unhappiness, a melancholy of some sort, which I couldn't define exactly, and I didn't find that state noble in any way. Don Juan laughed and said, You're beginning to learn. This type of learning is not for me. I'm not made for it, Don Juan. You always exaggerate. This isn't exaggeration. It is. The only trouble is that you exaggerate the bad points only. There are no good points so far as I am concerned. All I know is that it makes me afraid. There's nothing wrong with being afraid. When you fear, you see things in a different way. But I don't care about seeing things in a different way, Don Juan. I think I'm going to leave the learning about Mezcalito alone. I can't handle it, Don Juan. This is really a bad situation for me. Of course it's bad, even for me. You're not the only one who's baffled. Why should you be baffled, Don Juan? I've been thinking about what I saw the other night. Mezcalito actually played with you. That baffled me, because it was an indication, an omen. What kind of an indication, Don Juan? Mezcalito was pointing you out to me. What for? It wasn't clear to me then, but now it is. He meant you were the chosen man, or escogido. Mezcalito pointed you out to me, and by doing that, he told me you were the chosen man. Do you mean I was chosen among others for some task or something of the sort? No. What I mean is, Mezcalito told me you could be the man I'm looking for. When did he tell you that, Don Juan? By playing with you, he told me that. This makes you the chosen man for me. What does it mean to be the chosen man? There are some secrets I know. Tengo secretos. I have secrets I won't be able to reveal to anyone unless I find my chosen man. The other night when I saw you playing with Mezcalito, it was clear to me you were that man. But you're not an Indian. How baffling. But what does it mean to me, Don Juan? What do I have to do? I've made up my mind, and I'm going to teach you the secrets that make up the lot of a man of knowledge. Do you mean the secrets about Mezcalito? Yes, but those are not all the secrets I know. There are others, of a different kind, which I would like to give to someone. I had a teacher myself, a benefactor, and I also became his chosen man upon performing a certain feat. He taught me all I know. I asked him again what this new role would require of me. He said learning was the only thing involved, learning in the sense of what I had experienced in the 2 sessions with him. The way in which the situation had evolved was quite strange. I'd made up my mind to tell him I was going to give up the idea of learning about peyote, and then before I could really make my point, he offered to teach me his knowledge. I didn't know what he meant by that, but I felt that this sudden turn was very serious. I argued I had no qualifications for such a task, as it required a rare kind of courage which I didn't have. I told him that my bent of character was to talk about acts others performed. I wanted to hear his views and opinions about everything. I told him I could be happy if I could sit there and listen to him talk for days. To me, that would be learning. He listened without interrupting me. I talked for a long time. Then he said, "All this is very easy to understand. Fear is the first natural enemy a man must overcome on his path to knowledge. Besides, you're curious. That evens up the score. And you'll learn in spite of yourself. That's the rule." I protested for a while longer, trying to dissuade him, but he seemed to be convinced there was nothing else I could do but learn. "You're not thinking in the proper order," he said. "Mezcalito actually played with you. That's the point to think about. Why don't you dwell on that instead of on your fear?" Was it so unusual? You are the only person I have ever seen playing with him. You're not used to this kind of life. Therefore, the indications, omens, bypass you. Yet you're a serious person, but your seriousness is attached to what you do, not to what goes on outside you. You dwell upon yourself too much. That's the trouble, and that produces a terrible fatigue. But what else can anyone do, Don Juan? Seek and see the marvels all around you. You'll get tired of looking at yourself alone, and that fatigue will make you deaf and blind to everything else. You have a point, Don Juan, but how can I change? Think about the wonder of Mezcalito playing with you. Think about nothing else. The rest will come to you of itself.
Thursday, August 17th, 1961. As soon as I got out of my car, I complained to Don Juan that I wasn't feeling well. Sit down, he said softly, and almost led me by the hand to his porch. He smiled and patted me on the back. 2 weeks before, on August 4th, Don Juan, as he had said, changed his tactics with me and allowed me to ingest some peyote buttons. During the height of my hallucinatory experience, I played with a dog that lived in the house where the peyote session took place. Don Juan interpreted my interaction with the dog as a very special event. He contended that at moments of power, such as the one I had been living then, the world of ordinary affairs didn't exist, and nothing could be taken for granted, that the dog was not really a dog, but the incarnation of Mezcalito, the power of the deity contained in peyote. The post-effects of that experience were a general sense of fatigue and melancholy, plus the incidence of exceptionally vivid dreams and nightmares. "Where's your writing gear?" Don Juan asked as I sat down on the porch. I had left my notebooks in my car. Don Juan walked back to the car and carefully pulled out my briefcase and brought it to my side. He asked if I usually carried my briefcase when I walked. I said I did. "That's madness," he said. "I've told you never to carry anything in your hands when you walk. Get a knapsack." I laughed. The idea of carrying my notes in a knapsack was ludicrous. I told him that ordinarily I wore a suit, and a knapsack over a three-piece suit would be a preposterous sight. "Put your coat on over the knapsack," he said. "It's better that people think you're a hunchback than to ruin your body carrying all this around." He urged me to get out my notebook and write. He seemed to be making a deliberate effort to put me at ease. I complained again about the feeling of physical discomfort and the strange sense of unhappiness I was experiencing. Don Juan laughed and said, "You're beginning to learn." We then had a long conversation. He said that Mezcalito, by allowing me to play with him, had pointed me out as a chosen man, and that, although he was baffled by the omen because I was not an Indian, he was going to pass on to me some secret knowledge. He said that he had had a benefactor himself, who taught him how to become a man of knowledge. I sensed that something dreadful was about to happen. The revelation that I was his chosen man, plus the unquestionable strangeness of his ways, and the devastating effect that peyote had had on me, created a state of unbearable apprehension and indecision. But Don Juan disregarded my feelings, and recommended that I should only think of the wonder of Mezcalito playing with me. "Think about nothing else," he said. "The rest will come to you of itself." He stood up and patted me gently on the head, and said in a very soft voice, "I am going to teach you how to become a warrior, in the same manner I've taught you how to hunt. I must warn you, though. Learning how to hunt has not made you into a hunter, nor would learning how to become a warrior make you one." I experienced a sense of frustration, a physical discomfort that bordered on anguish. I complained about the vivid dreams and nightmares I was having. He seemed to deliberate for a moment and sat down again. They're weird dreams, I said. You've always had weird dreams, he retorted. I'm telling you, this time, they're truly more weird than anything I've ever had. Don't concern yourself. They're only dreams. Like the dreams of any ordinary dreamer, they don't have power. So what's the use of worrying about them or talking about them? They bother me, Don Juan. Isn't there something I can do to stop them? Nothing. Let them pass, he said. Now it's time for you to become accessible to power, and you're going to begin by tackling dreaming. The tone of voice he used when he said dreaming made me think that he was using the word in a very particular fashion. I was pondering about a proper question to ask when he began to talk again. I've never told you about dreaming, because until now I was only concerned with teaching you how to be a hunter, he said. A hunter is not concerned with the manipulation of power. Therefore, his dreams are only dreams. They might be poignant, but they are not dreaming. A warrior, on the other hand, seeks power, and one of the avenues to power is dreaming. You may say that the difference between a hunter and a warrior is that a warrior is on his way to power, while a hunter knows nothing, or very little about it. The decision as to who can be a warrior and who can only be a hunter is not up to us. That decision is in the realm of the powers that guide men. That's why your playing with Mescalito was such an important omen. Those forces guided you to me. They took you to that bus depot, remember? Some clown brought you to me. A perfect omen, a clown pointing you out. So I taught you how to be a hunter. And then the other perfect omen, Mescalito himself, playing with you. See what I mean? His weird logic was overwhelming. His words created visions of myself succumbing to something awesome and unknown, something which I hadn't bargained for, and which I had not conceived existed, even in my wildest fantasies. What do you propose I should do? I asked. Become accessible to power. Tackle your dreams, he replied. You call them dreams because you have no power. A warrior, being a man who seeks power, doesn't call them dreams. He calls them real. You mean he takes his dreams as being reality? He doesn't take anything as being anything else. What you call dreams are real for a warrior. You must understand that a warrior is not a fool. A warrior is an immaculate hunter who hunts power. He's not drunk or crazed, and he has neither the time nor the disposition to bluff or to lie to himself or to make a wrong move. The stakes are too high for that. The stakes are his trimmed, orderly life, which he's taken so long to tighten and perfect. He's not going to throw that away by making some stupid miscalculation, by taking something for being something else. Dreaming is real for a warrior, because in it he can act deliberately, he can choose and reject, he can select from a variety of items those which lead to power, and then he can manipulate them and use them, while in an ordinary dream he cannot act deliberately. Do you mean then, Don Juan, that dreaming is real? Of course it's real. As real as what we're doing now. If you want to compare things, I can say that it's perhaps more real. In dreaming, you have power. You can change things. You may find out countless concealed facts. You can control whatever you want. Don Juan's premises always had appealed to me at a certain level. I could easily understand his liking the idea that one could do anything in dreams, but I couldn't take him seriously. The jump was too great. We looked at each other for a moment. His statements were insane, and yet he was, to the best of my knowledge, one of the most level-headed men I had ever met. I told him that I couldn't believe he took his dreams to be reality. He chuckled, as if he knew the magnitude of my untenable position. Then he stood up without saying a word and walked inside his house. I sat for a long time in a state of stupor, until he called me to the back of his house. He'd made some corn gruel and handed me a bowl. I asked him about the time when one was awake. I wanted to know if he called it anything in particular, but he didn't understand or didn't want to answer. "What do you call this? What we're doing now?" I asked, meaning that what we were doing was reality as opposed to dreams. "I call it eating," he said, and contained his laughter. "I call it reality," I said, "because our eating is actually taking place." "Dreaming also takes place," he replied, giggling. "And so does hunting, walking, laughing." I didn't persist in arguing. I couldn't, however, even if I stretched myself beyond my limits, accept his premise. He seemed to be delighted with my despair. As soon as we had finished eating, he casually stated that we were going to go for a hike, but we weren't going to roam in the desert in the manner we had done before. "It's different this time," he said. "From now on, we're going to places of power. You're going to learn how to make yourself accessible to power." I again expressed my turmoil. I said I wasn't qualified for that endeavor. "Come on, you're indulging in silly fears," he said in a low voice, patting me on the back and smiling benevolently. "I've been catering to your hunter's spirit. You like to roam with me in this beautiful desert. It's too late for you to quit." He began to walk into the desert chaparral. He signaled me with his head to follow him. I could have walked to my car and left, except that I liked to roam in that beautiful desert with him. I liked the sensation, which I experienced only in his company, that this was indeed an awesome, mysterious, yet beautiful world. As he said, I was hooked. Don Juan led me to the hills towards the east. It was a long hike. It was a hot day. The heat, however, which ordinarily would have been unbearable to me, was somehow unnoticeable. We walked for quite a distance into a canyon until Don Juan came to a halt and sat down in the shade of some boulders. I took some crackers out of my knapsack, but he told me not to bother with them. He said that I should sit in a prominent place. He pointed to a single, almost round boulder, 10 or 15 feet away, and helped me climb to the top. I thought he was also going to sit there, but instead, he just climbed part of the way in order to hand me some pieces of dry meat. He told me with a deadly serious expression that it was power meat, and should be chewed very slowly, and should not be mixed with any other food. He then walked back to the shaded area and sat down with his back against a rock. He seemed relaxed, almost sleepy. He remained in the same position until I had finished eating. Then he sat up straight and tilted his head to the right. He seemed to be listening attentively. He glanced at me 2 or 3 times, stood up abruptly, and began to scan the surroundings with his eyes the way a hunter would do. I automatically froze on the spot and only moved my eyes in order to follow his movements. Very carefully, he stepped behind some rocks, as if he were expecting game to come into the area where we were. I realized then that we were in a round, cove-like bend in the dry water canyon, surrounded by sandstone boulders. Don Juan suddenly came out from behind the rocks and smiled at me. He stretched his arms, yawned, and walked towards the boulder where I was. I relaxed my tense position and sat down. "What happened?" I asked in a whisper. He answered me, yelling that there was nothing around there to worry about. I felt an immediate jolt in my stomach. His answer was inappropriate, and it was inconceivable to me that he would yell unless he had a specific reason for it. I began to slide down from the boulder, but he yelled that I should stay there a while longer. "What are you doing?" I asked. He sat down and concealed himself between two rocks at the base of the boulder where I was, and then he said in a very loud voice that he had only been looking around because he thought he had heard something. I asked if he had heard a large animal. He put his hand to his ear and yelled that he was unable to hear me and that I should shout my words. I felt ill at ease yelling, but he urged me in a loud voice to speak up. I shouted that I wanted to know what was going on, and he shouted back that there was really nothing around there. He yelled, asking if I could see anything unusual from the top of the boulder. I said no, and he asked me to describe to him the terrain towards the south. We shouted back and forth for a while, and then he signaled me to come down. I joined him, and he whispered in my ear that the yelling was necessary to make our presence known, because I had to make myself accessible to the power of that specific waterhole. I looked around, but couldn't see the waterhole. He pointed that we were standing on it. "There's water here," he said in a whisper, "and also power. There's a spirit here, and we have to lure it out. Perhaps it'll come after you." I wanted to know more about the alleged spirit, but he insisted on total silence. He advised me to stay perfectly still and not let out a whisper or make the slightest movement to betray our presence. Apparently, it was easy for him to remain in complete immobility for hours. For me, however, it was sheer torture. My legs fell asleep, my back ached, and tension built up around my neck and shoulders. My entire body became numb and cold. I was in great discomfort when Don Juan finally stood up. He just sprung to his feet and extended his hand to me to help me stand up. As I was trying to stretch my legs, I realized the inconceivable easiness with which Don Juan had jumped up after hours of immobility. It took quite some time for my muscles to regain the elasticity needed for walking. Don Juan headed back for the house. He walked extremely slowly. He set up a length of 3 paces as the distance I should observe in following him. He meandered around the regular route and crossed it 4 or 5 times in different directions. When we finally arrived at his house, it was late afternoon. I tried to question him about the events of the day. He explained that talking was unnecessary. For the time being, I had to refrain from asking questions until we were in a place of power. I was dying to know what he meant by that, and tried to whisper a question, but he reminded me with a cold, severe look that he meant business. We sat on the porch for hours. I worked on my notes. From time to time, he handed me a piece of dry meat. Finally, it was too dark to write. I tried to think about the new developments, but some part of myself refused to, and I fell asleep. Saturday, August 19th, 1961. Yesterday morning, Don Juan and I drove to town and ate breakfast at a restaurant. He advised me not to change my eating habits too drastically. "Your body's not used to power meat," he said. "You'd get sick if you didn't eat your food." He himself ate heartily. When I joked about it, he simply said, "My body likes everything." Around noon, we hiked back to the water canyon. We proceeded to make ourselves noticeable to the spirit by noisy talk and by a forced silence, which lasted hours. When we left the place, instead of heading back to the house, Don Juan took off in the direction of the mountains. We reached some mild slopes first, and then we climbed to the top of some high hills. There Don Juan picked out a spot to rest in the open, unshaded area. He told me that we had to wait until dusk and that I should conduct myself in the most natural fashion, which included asking all the questions I wanted. "I know that the spirit is out there lurking," he said in a very low voice. Where? Out there, in the bushes.
What kind of spirit is it? He looked at me with a quizzical expression and retorted,
How many kinds are there?
We both laughed. I was asking questions out of nervousness.
It'll come out at dusk, he said. We just have to wait.
I remained quiet. I had run out of questions.
This is the time when we must keep on talking, he said. The human voice attracts spirits. There's one lurking out there now. We're making ourselves available to it, so keep on talking.
I experienced an idiotic sense of vacuity. I couldn't think of anything to say. He laughed and patted me on the back.
You're truly a pill, he said. When you have to talk, you lose your tongue. Come on, beat your gums.
He made a hilarious gesture of beating his gums together, opening and closing his mouth with great speed.
There's certain things we'll talk about from now on only at places of power, he went on. I've brought you here because this is your first trial. This is a place of power, and here we can talk only about power.
I really don't know what power is, I said.
Power is something a warrior deals with, he said. At first it's an incredible, far-fetched affair. It's hard to even think about it. This is what's happening to you now. Then, power becomes a serious matter. One may not have it, or one may not even fully realize that it exists. Yet one knows that something is there. Something which was not noticeable before. Next, power is manifested as something uncontrollable that comes to oneself. It's not possible for me to say how it comes or what it really is. It is nothing, and yet it makes marvels appear before your very eyes. And finally, power is something in oneself, something that controls one's acts and yet obeys one's command.
There was a short pause. Don Juan asked me if I had understood. I felt ludicrous saying I did. He seemed to have noticed my dismay and chuckled.
I am going to teach you right here the first step to power, he said, as if he were dictating a letter to me. I am going to teach you how to set up dreaming.
He looked at me and again asked me if I knew what he meant. I did not. I was hardly following him at all. He explained that to set up dreaming meant to have a concise and pragmatic control over the general situation of a dream, comparable to the control one has over any choice in the desert, such as climbing up a hill or remaining in the shade of a water canyon. You must start by doing something very simple, he said. Tonight, in your dreams, you must look at your hands. I laughed out loud. His tone was so factual that it was as if he were telling me to do something commonplace. Why do you laugh? He asked with surprise. How can I look at my hands in my dreams? Very simple. Focus your eyes on them, just like this. He bent his head forward and stared at his hands with his mouth open. His gesture was so comical that I had to laugh. Seriously, how can you expect me to do that? I asked. The way I've told you, he snapped. You can, of course, look at whatever you goddamn please, your toes or your belly or your pecker for that matter. I said your hands because that's the easiest thing for me to look at. Don't think it's a joke. Dreaming is as serious as seeing or dying or any other thing in this awesome, mysterious world. Think of it as something entertaining. Imagine all the inconceivable things you could accomplish. A man hunting for power has almost no limits in his dreaming. I asked him to give me some pointers. There aren't any pointers, he said. Just look at your hands. There must be more that you could tell me, I insisted.
He shook his head and squinted his eyes, staring at me in short glances. "Every one of us is different," he finally said. "What you call pointers would only be what I myself did when I was learning. We are not the same. We aren't even vaguely alike." "Maybe anything you'd say would help me." "It would be simpler for you just to start looking at your hands." He seemed to be organizing his thoughts and bobbed his head up and down. "Every time you look at anything in your dreams, it changes shape," he said after a long silence. "The trick in learning to set up dreaming is obviously not just to look at things, but to sustain the sight of them. Dreaming is real when one has succeeded in bringing everything into focus. Then there is no difference between what you do when you sleep and what you do when you are not sleeping. Do you see what I mean?"
I confessed that although I understood what he had said, I was incapable of accepting his premise. I brought up the point that in a civilized world there were scores of people who had delusions and could not distinguish what took place in the real world from what took place in their fantasies. I said that such persons were undoubtedly mentally ill, and my uneasiness increased every time he would recommend I should act like a crazy man. After my long explanation, Don Juan made a comical gesture of despair by putting his hands to his cheeks and sighing loudly. "Leave your civilized world alone," he said. "Let it be. Nobody is asking you to behave like a madman. I've already told you, a warrior has to be perfect in order to deal with the powers he hunts. How can you conceive that a warrior would not be able to tell things apart? On the other hand, you, my friend, who know what the real world is, would fumble and die in no time at all if you would have to depend on your ability for telling what is real and what is not." I, obviously, had not expressed what I really had in mind. Every time I protested, I was simply voicing the unbearable frustration of being in an untenable position. "I'm not trying to make you into a sick, crazy man," Don Juan went on. "You can do that yourself without my help. But the forces that guide us brought you to me, and I have been endeavoring to teach you to change your stupid ways and live the strong, clean life of a hunter. Then the forces guided you again and told me that you should learn to live the impeccable life of a warrior. Apparently, you can't, but who can tell? We are as mysterious and as awesome as this unfathomable world. So who can tell what you're capable of?" There was an underlying tone of sadness in Don Juan's voice. I wanted to apologize, but he began to talk again. "You don't have to look at your hands," he said. "Like I've said, pick anything at all. But pick one thing in advance and find it in your dreams. I said your hands because they'll always be there. When they begin to change shape, you must move your sight away from them and pick something else, and then look at your hands again. It takes a long time to perfect this technique." I had become so involved in writing that I hadn't noticed that it was getting dark. The sun had already disappeared over the horizon. The sky was cloudy, and the twilight was imminent. Don Juan stood up and gave furtive glances towards the south. "Let's go," he said. "We must walk south until the spirit of the waterhole shows itself." We walked for perhaps half an hour. The terrain changed abruptly, and we came to a barren area. There was a large round hill where the chaparral had burnt. It looked like a bald head. We walked towards it. I thought that Don Juan was going to climb the mild slope, but he stopped instead and remained in a very attentive position. His body seemed to have tensed as a single unit and shivered for an instant. Then he relaxed again and stood limply. I couldn't figure out how his body could remain erect while his muscles were so relaxed.
At that moment, a very strong gust of wind jolted me. Don Juan's body turned in the direction of the wind, towards the west. He didn't use his muscles to turn, or at least he didn't use them the way I would use mine to turn. Don Juan's body seemed rather to have been pulled from the outside. It was as if someone else had arranged his body to face a new direction. I kept on staring at him. He looked at me from the corner of his eye. The expression on his face was one of determination, purpose. All of his being was attentive, and I stared at him in wonder. I had never been in any situation that called for such a strange concentration. Suddenly his body shivered as though he had been splashed by a sudden shower of cold water. He had another jolt, and then he started to walk as if nothing had happened. I followed him. We flanked the naked hills on the east side until we were at the middle part of it. He stopped there, turning to face the west. From where we stood, the top of the hill was not so round and smooth as it had seemed to be from the distance. There was a cave, or a hole, near the top. I looked at it fixedly, because Don Juan was doing the same. Another strong gust of wind sent a chill up my spine. Don Juan turned towards the south and scanned the area with his eyes. "There!" he said in a whisper, and pointed to an object on the ground. I strained my eyes to see. There was something on the ground, perhaps 20 feet away. It was light brown, and as I looked at it, it shivered. I focused all my attention on it. The object was almost round and seemed to be curled. In fact, it looked like a curled-up dog. "What is it?" I whispered to Don Juan. "I don't know," he whispered back as he peered at the object. "What does it look like to you?" I told him that it seemed to be a dog. "Too large for a dog," he said matter-of-factly. I took a couple of steps towards it, but Don Juan stopped me gently. I stared at it again. It was definitely some animal that was either asleep or dead. I could almost see its head. Its ears protruded like the ears of a wolf. By then I was definitely sure that it was a curled-up animal. I thought that it could have been a brown calf. I whispered that to Don Juan. He answered that it was too compact to be a calf. Besides, its ears were pointed. The animal shivered again, and then I noticed that it was alive. I could actually see that it was breathing, yet it didn't seem to breathe rhythmically. The breaths that it took were more like irregular shivers. I had a sudden realization at that moment. "It's an animal that is dying," I whispered to Don Juan. "You're right," he whispered back. "But what kind of an animal?" I couldn't make out its specific features. Don Juan took a couple of cautious steps towards it. I followed him. It was quite dark by then, and we had to take 2 more steps in order to keep the animal in view. "Watch out," Don Juan whispered in my ear. "If it's a dying animal, it may leap on us with its last strength." The animal, whatever it was, seemed to be on its last legs. Its breathing was irregular. Its body shook spasmodically, but it didn't change its curled-up position. At a given moment, however, a tremendous spasm actually lifted the animal off the ground. I heard an inhuman shriek, and the animal stretched its legs. Its claws were more than frightening. They were nauseating. The animal tumbled on its side after stretching its legs, and then rolled on its back. I heard a formidable growl, and Don Juan's voice shouting, "Run for your life!" And that was exactly what I did. I scrambled towards the top of the hill with unbelievable speed and agility. When I was halfway to the top, I looked back and saw Don Juan standing in the same place. He signaled me to come down. I ran down the hill. "What happened?" I asked, completely out of breath. "I think the animal is dead," he said. We advanced cautiously towards the animal. It was sprawled on its back. As I came closer to it, I nearly yelled with fright. I realized that it was not quite dead yet. Its body was still trembling. Its legs, which were sticking up in the air, shook wildly. The animal was definitely in its last gasps. I walked in front of Don Juan. A new jolt moved the animal's body, and I could see its head. I turned to Don Juan, horrified. Judging by its body, the animal was obviously a mammal, yet it had a beak, like a bird. I stared at it in complete and absolute horror. My mind refused to believe it. I was dumbfounded. I couldn't even articulate a word. Never in my whole existence had I witnessed anything of that nature. Something inconceivable was there, in front of my very eyes. I wanted Don Juan to explain that incredible animal, but I could only mumble to him. He was staring at me. I glanced at him, and glanced at the animal, and then something in me arranged the world, and I knew at once what the animal was. I walked over to it and picked it up. It was a large branch of a bush. It had been burnt, and possibly the wind had blown some burnt debris which got caught in the dry branch, and thus gave the appearance of a large, bulging, round animal. The color of the burnt debris made it look light brown in contrast with the green vegetation. I laughed at my idiocy, and excitedly explained to Don Juan that the wind blowing through it had made it look like a live animal. I thought he would be pleased with the way I had resolved the mystery, but he turned around and began walking to the top of the hill. I followed him. He crawled inside the depression that looked like a cave. It wasn't a hole, but a shallow dent in the sandstone. Don Juan took some small branches and used them to scoop up the dirt that had accumulated in the bottom of the depression. "We have to get rid of the ticks," he said. He signaled me to sit down and told me to make myself comfortable because we were going to spend the night there. I began to talk about the branch, but he hushed me up. "What you've done is no triumph," he said. "You've wasted a beautiful power, a power that blew life into that dry twig." He said that a real triumph would have been for me to let go and follow the power until the world had ceased to exist. He didn't seem to be angry with me or disappointed with my performance. He repeatedly stated that this was only the beginning, that it took time to handle power. He patted me on the shoulder and joked that earlier that day I was the person who knew what was real and what was not. I felt embarrassed. I began to apologize for my tendency of always being so sure of my ways. "It doesn't matter," he said. "That branch was a real animal, and it was alive at the moment the power touched it. Since what kept it alive was power, the trick was, like in dreaming, to sustain the sight of it. See what I mean?" I wanted to ask something else, but he hushed me up and said that I should remain completely silent but awake all night, and that he alone was going to talk for a while. He said that the spirit, which knew his voice, might become subdued with the sound of it and leave us alone. He explained that the idea of making oneself accessible to power had serious overtones. Power was a devastating force that could easily lead to one's death and had to be treated with great care. Becoming available to power had to be done systematically, but always with great caution. It involved making one's presence obvious by a contained display of loud talk or any other type of noisy activity, and then it was mandatory to observe a prolonged and total silence. A controlled outburst and a controlled quietness were the mark of a warrior. He said that properly, I should have sustained the sight of the live monster for a while longer. In a controlled fashion, without losing my mind or becoming deranged with excitation or fear, I should have striven to stop the world. He pointed out that after I had run up the hill for dear life, I was in a perfect state for stopping the world. Combined in that state were fear, awe, power, and death. He said that such a state would be pretty hard to repeat. I whispered in his ear, What do you mean by stopping the world? He gave me a ferocious look before he answered that it was a technique practiced by those who were hunting for power, a technique by virtue of which the world as we know it was made to collapse.
My difficulty in grasping his concepts and methods stemmed from the fact that the units of his description were alien and incompatible with those of my own. His contention was that he was teaching me how to see, as opposed to merely looking, and that stopping the world was the first step to seeing. For years I had treated the idea of stopping the world as a cryptic metaphor that really didn't mean anything. It was only during an informal conversation that took place towards the end of my apprenticeship that I came to fully realize its scope and importance as one of the main propositions of Don Juan's knowledge. Don Juan and I had been talking about different things in a relaxed and unstructured manner. I told him about a friend of mine, and his dilemma with his 9-year-old son. The child who'd been living with the mother for the past 4 years was then living with my friend, and the problem was what to do with him. According to my friend, the child was a misfit in school. He lacked concentration and wasn't interested in anything. He was given to tantrums, disruptive behavior, and to running away from home. "Your friend certainly does have a problem," Don Juan said, laughing. I wanted to keep on telling him all the terrible things the child had done, but he interrupted me. "There's no need to say any more about that poor little boy," he said. "There's no need for you or for me to regard his actions in our thoughts one way or another." His manner was abrupt, and his tone was firm, but then he smiled. "What can my friend do?" I asked. "The worst thing he could do is to force the child to agree with him," Don Juan said. "What do you mean?" "I mean that child shouldn't be spanked or scared by his father when he doesn't behave the way he wants him to." "How can he teach him anything if he isn't firm with him?" "Your friend should let someone else spank the child." "He can't let anyone else touch his little boy," I said, surprised at his suggestion. Don Juan seemed to enjoy my reaction and giggled. "Your friend is not a warrior," he said. "If he were, he would know that the worst thing one can do is to confront human beings bluntly." "What does a warrior do, Don Juan?" "A warrior proceeds strategically." "I still don't understand what you mean." "I mean that if your friend were a warrior, he would help his child to stop the world." "How can my friend do that?" "He would need personal power. He would need to be a sorcerer." "But he isn't." "In that case, he must use ordinary means to help his son to change his idea of the world. It's not stopping the world, but it'll work just the same." I asked him to explain his statements. "If I were your friend," Don Juan said, "I would start by hiring someone to spank the little guy. I would go to Skid Row and hire the worst-looking man I could find." "To scare a little boy?" "Not just to scare a little boy, you fool. That little fellow must be stopped, and being beaten by his father won't do it. If one wants to stop our fellow men, one must always be outside the circle that presses them. That way, one can always direct the pressure." The idea was preposterous, but somehow it was appealing to me. Don Juan was resting his chin on his left palm. His left arm was propped against his chest on a wooden box that served as a low table. His eyes were closed, but his eyeballs moved. I felt he was looking at me through his eyelids. The thought scared me. "Tell me more about what my friend should do with his little boy," I said. "Tell him to go to Skid Row, and very carefully. Select an ugly-looking derelict," he went on. "Tell him to get a young one who still has some strength left in him." Don Juan then delineated a strange strategy. I was to instruct my friend to have the man follow him, or wait for him at a place where he would go with his son. The man, in response to a prearranged cue to be given after any objectionable behavior on the part of the child, was supposed to leap from a hiding place, pick the child up, and spank the living daylights out of him. After the man scares him, your friend must help the little boy regain his confidence in any way he can. If he follows this procedure 3 or 4 times, I assure you that child will feel differently towards everything. He will change his idea of the world. What if the fright injures him? Fright never injures anyone. What injures the spirit is having someone always on your back, beating you, telling you what to do and what not to do. When that boy is more contained, you must tell your friend to do one last thing for him. He must find some way to get to a dead child, perhaps in a hospital, or at the office of a doctor. He must take his son there and show the dead child to him. He must let him touch the corpse once with his left hand, on any place except the corpse's belly. After the boy does that, he'll be renewed. The world will never be the same for him. I realized then that throughout the years of our association, Don Juan had been employing with me, although on a different scale, the same tactics he was suggesting my friend should use with his son. I asked him about it. He said that he'd been trying all along to teach me how to stop the world. "You haven't yet," he said, smiling. "Nothing seems to work, because you're very stubborn. If you were less stubborn, however, by now you'd probably have stopped the world with any of the techniques I've taught you." "What techniques, Don Juan?" "Everything I have told you to do was a technique for stopping the world."